A very good morning to one and all here. A high note of expectation has been set, probably by the opening words of my friend Rajesh describing me as a star. Luckily, he didn't refer to it as a star that is eclipsed or that had a meteoric fall. Anyway, thanks for such beautiful words in describing me. Probably he referred to the upper portion of my body while he referred to my star, because something is getting reflected. The aura, right? No, I have a small request to put before you. When I am described as a person of enormous capabilities, saying that, what to say, a broadcaster, a voice caster, and a teacher, of all that, my request is very simple, that you have to bear in mind the fact that I'm not going to make a pompous parade of my erudition or scholarship here, particularly relating to diaspora as a concept and diaspora theories, by making frequent references to frightening names like William Safran, John Armstrong, Robin Cohen, Tololian, and others, or, post-colonial theorists like Homi K. Baba, Gayatri Spivak, or Edward Said, and others. Of course, there will be occasions where I will recall these names and I will make a passing reference to some of the comments made by them. So please don't expect anything of an academic misadventure from my part. What I am trying to do is, just at least for the sake of clarity of ideas pertaining to the very concept of diaspora and the diaspora theories, which has become part of post-colonial studies today, and which has been widely discussed and debated upon, contested, negotiated widely. Probably there are spaces of theorizing connected with this, and those intricacies of theorizing wouldn't be the focus of my presentation. I would briefly adumbrate or outline the kind of lecture that I would like to, or I plan to deliver to you. I would begin with defining the concept of displacement in simple layman's language, understandable. Okay, I should not be charged with oversimplifying things, or essentializing things, or having a reductionist stance on that. But I think apart from the teachers and the research scholars who are assembled here, majority of the audience, I think, happens to be students, and therefore for their understanding I will try to make a layman's presentation rather than delving deep into the theoretical part of it. My attempt would be to define the concepts of displacement, dislocation, or probably I will not go into that terrifying concept of disjuncture of Appadurai. I will not go into that, because that will be frightening and will drive you out of your sense sometimes. After that, I will explain how displacement is connected with dislocation and how it has subsumed under the study of diaspora, the broad category, the generic term diaspora. I will not trace the origin, because everybody here, I think, know the genesis of the term diaspora connected with the Greek translation of the Bible and how people started scattering. And later, I would be trying to analyze or just, trace the trajectory of the development of displacement studies and the problem of displacement historically. I'm not a historian. I don't have any authenticity, because history itself is metafiction, as we know. So I don't believe in such grand narratives, but, a simple mapping of, the kind of discourses that emerged in connection with displacement in general and diaspora in particular will be the focus of my discussion, going through the different typologies, or what we call the morphology of the various types of diasporas that theorists have spoken about. I will start with the classical diaspora, Yes, everybody knows it, the classical or the pre-modern diaspora, beginning with the Jews, Armenians, and the Africans. From there, I will be moving to the second phase of diaspora, namely the colonial diaspora, beginning in the 16th century with the Dutch, then the French, Portuguese, the English, and other colonial powers, and how colonialism has become something like a discourse that has justified or vindicated the claim of displacement as a matter of right. Then the last phase, I will be summing up with what has happened after colonialism came to an end, the post-colonial scenario, how displacement has affected us in contemporary times. But I will, if time permits, I don't know whether I will be able to do that. If time permits, I will be winding up my session with a presentation of Indian diaspora as of today, particularly with reference to the Indian diaspora writers, if time permits, because that will be of some use to students of literature, because how the diaspora writers, how they are accepted, accommodated, and appreciated worldwide today in relation to the legacy of the old generation of Indian diaspora writers, who are believed to be the inheritors of the indenture legacy or the plantation workers legacy. So this is how I plan my things. I think the plan itself is very complex, right? Is it very complex? No, I don't ask questions, because asking questions, being a teacher who have been in the field of teaching for more than three decades officially and unofficially, I am tempted to ask questions, because, Vijay Masha Pande, is there anybody who can't understand Malayalam here? M.N. Vijay Masha പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു ഉദാഹരണമുണ്ട്. അങ്ങനെ ക്ലാസ്സിൽ അധ്യാപകൻ, എല്ലാവരും കേട്ട് കാണും, വളരെ പ്രസിദ്ധമായൊരു സംഭവമാണ് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ. അദ്ദേഹം ഒരു അധ്യാപകൻ കുട്ടിയോടൊരു ചോദ്യം ചോദിച്ചു. കുട്ടിക്ക് ഉത്തരം കിട്ടിയില്ല. ചോദ്യം ആവർത്തിക്കപ്പെട്ടു. കുട്ടി വീണ്ടും പരാജയപ്പെട്ടു. അധ്യാപകൻ്റെ നിയന്ത്രണം നഷ്ടപ്പെട്ടു. അദ്ദേഹം അലറി വിളിച്ചു, ഗെറ്റ് ഔട്ട് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു, കുട്ടിയെ പുറത്താക്കി. പിന്നെ വിജയമാഷ് എഴുതുന്ന വളരെ രസകരമായൊരു സെൻറ്റൻസാണ്. എന്താണ്? ആരെങ്കിലും കേട്ടിട്ടുണ്ടോ ഇത്? ഇല്ല, ഭാഗ്യം. അതുകൊണ്ട് തെറ്റിയാലും കുഴപ്പമില്ലല്ലോ. അദ്ദേഹം ഇങ്ങനെയാണ് എഴുതുന്നത്: ഉത്തരം കിട്ടാതെ ആ ചോദ്യം ക്ലാസ് മുറിക്ക് പുറത്തും, അകത്തില്ല, ക്ലാസ് മുറിക്ക് പുറത്തും വരാന്തയിലും ക്യാൻറ്റീനിലും മരച്ചുവട്ടിലും അലഞ്ഞു തിരിഞ്ഞു നടന്നു എന്നാണ്. റൈറ്റ്? അപ്പോൾ അതുകൊണ്ട് ഈ ചോദ്യം ചോദിക്കുക, അതിൻ്റെ ഉത്തരം കിട്ടുക എന്നൊക്കെ പറയുന്നത് സംതിങ് ദാറ്റ് വി കാൺട്ട് അഫോർഡ് ടു എക്സ്പെക്ട്. റൈറ്റ്? ഞാൻ ചോദിച്ച പോയിൽ ക്ഷമിക്കണം. I think that the very plan, I just wanted to give you some idea about how I proceed in my presentation, the way in which I progress from the early stage of diaspora to the final stage of Indian diaspora being honored worldwide today, which is something that is prestigious and that brings great esteem to the South Asian diaspora in general and Indian diaspora in particular, particularly with reference to the Indian writers living abroad and writing. Well, so I will begin with a simple definition of displacement. When I say simple, the concept is not very simple. Displacement is not a very simple concept, because it has an amazing degree of interdisciplinarity. In history, we study displacement. In sociology, we study displacement as a matter of mobility, horizontal as well as vertical mobility in sociology. How one can move from one stage of existence to another, maybe upward or downward. That is an instance of vertical mobility. In anthropology, we study about how different, peoples, plural, peoples in different epochs moved from one habitat to another, and the kind of changes that have happened to them. So there is an amazing degree of interdisciplinarity while we discuss the concept of displacement. And, as I told you already, it is closely connected to the concept of mobility. On the move. Remember that poem, okay. On the move. People are always on the move. When we talk about displacement, we are talking about a community or a group of people or individuals on the move. Right from, Abraham in the Old Testament of the Bible, Ulysses in Homer, okay, taking part in the Trojan War for long years and returning home, wandering, to come back to Ithaca to meet Penelope and his son Telemachus. Then there is Oedipus, the great, Greek hero who was expelled from Thebes, wandering. And finally, we have the picture of the wandering Jews worldwide. Even today, gypsies, pilgrims, travelers, tourists, guerrilla fighters, Maoists in Orissa, and even in Kerala, some parts of Kerala, wandering minstrels or scopes or gleemen, as they were called by different names during the ancient periods, moving from one place, singing songs and moving about. See, look at all these people. They were all displaced or dislocated people. Some had their own original home. Some didn't have any home at all. See, for example, nomads. They don't have a home to have a myth of returning. Because, there are certain characteristics which are identified by theories about, a diaspora. This myth of return and the existence of an imagined homeland, these two are cardinal. These two are very important. But for these people, some people, they are completely rootless. Completely rootless. They were not uprooted. Somebody can be uprooted only if they are rooted. But some people, like nomads, they were never rooted. But always, all these categories of people, they were always on the move. So mobility and displacement are terms that are closely interconnected, because displacement invariably leads to mobility or moving from one place to another, maybe comfortably or with discomfiture, right? And this kind of displacement can take various forms. Say, for example, theorists have identified various kinds of displacement, like migration or exile or emigre, emigre, or refugees. Yes, we are today very familiar with the issue of refugees, the Syrian refugees. And also we have this problem in, Asian communities. Then there is another category based on displacement described as expatriates, then nomads. But whenever we speak about these different categories of displaced people and communities, we always keep in our mind the essential quality of a people moving from one place to another. It may be due to external aggression or a warlike situation, when one country is attacked by another. Say, for example, the Aryan invasion in India. It was an invasion when people, they were forced to leave. It could be the result of an external aggression or internal civil war, typically characteristic of African countries. Always there are, internal bickerings and internal strife. But I can give you some examples of internal as well as external problems. Take the example of the liberation of Bangladesh. What was the immediate consequence of the liberation of Bangladesh? It resulted in an exodus of or influx of large number of people, refugees, crossing the border to India. So we had to accommodate them. We had to accept them, the influx of refugees from Bangladesh. You take, in 1972, Idi Amin, the ruler of East Africa, East African country, Uganda. What did he do? He declared a kind of ethnic cleansing. As a result, several Indians, millions of them, had to flee from Uganda to Britain. From there, finally, to America. And if you look at the demographic profile of today's UK, there's an interesting statistic that about 1/3 of the Indian diaspora now living in the UK happen to be people who fled from Uganda as a result of the ethnic cleansing. ethnic cleansing initiated by Idi Amin, the dictator. Right. Also look at the instance of terrorism in Kashmir and the Pandits fleeing Kashmir. And now, yes, paradoxically, the government has been saying that now the Pandits can come back. Their home is ready. But we are not very sure that the Pandits will come back in all probability. We do not know exactly whether they will return or not. But now Kashmir has been rendered their home. In fact, they return or whether they don't return is a matter that is yet to be discussed. Similarly, we have, people moving right from the 1930s, 40s, 50s and 60s, along with my ancestors from Central Travancore and Southern Travancore to Malabar, right from 1930s. You can just imagine, these are all, instances of people's moving. Probably the compulsions are different. The reasons are different. Maybe the migration of people to Malabar since 1930s could be thought of as something that was necessitated by the quest for survival. Shortage of agricultural land and plenty of agricultural land was there, and probably the socio-economic factors were predominant in such migrations or such movements. And another instance or another reason for displacement to take place could be, as Suja ma'am has rightly pointed out, because of the developmental initiatives undertaken by governments. And the best example is Sardar Sarovar Dam, built across Narmada Bachao Andolan. And we know hundreds of villages got inundated and they had to be evacuated without proper facilities of rehabilitating the people thus evacuated from the affected regions. So development can also be a contributory factor that may result in displacement of large number of people. Now, I come to the classical example. I refer to the three periods of how displacement, now discussed under the broad rubric of diaspora, has evolved itself through three different stages. The first stage is often referred to as the classical diaspora or the pre-modern diaspora, often referring to the hardships, torture, the cataclysmic events connected with the razing of the walls of Jerusalem by the Romans, in the 3rd century BC or something of that sort. I'm not very clear about the period or the year. And how the Jews were persecuted, or how they were, subject to traumatic events, and how, in a succession, they got dispersed or scattered to different parts of the world. Am I going very fast? Very slow? The ideal type? Thank you. Right. Well, so it all began with this case of the Jews. For many a long year, theories on displacement studies, they focused this as the prototype, or the Jewish experience as the prototype of all diasporas. And only by the 1980s, realization dawned upon the thinkers and theorists working in this area, domain of knowledge, that this no longer holds valid to take this as the prototype of all diaspora, the Jewish experience, because the Jews were subject to different periods of torture, latest by the Holocaust upon them by Hitler, Nazi Germany. So the traumatic event which had its roots in the prehistoric or pre-modern period, continued until Hitler, the Jews. And thus we have today the concept of, the wandering Jew. The wandering Jew has become a prototype as far as we are concerned. And they always feel that they are always in exile. They are always in exile. Until 1978, when the Syrian kingdom was, 1948, when the Syrian kingdom was divided by the British rulers before they left, and thus created a separate state of Israel as the homeland for the Jews. Until then, they were always on the move. Always moving from place to place in exile, perennial exile. One should describe it as perennial exile. Well, so the second phase begins with colonialism. But when I say that, displacement or diaspora is a feeling of geographic dispersal. There are two levels of, diasporic experience. The one is, you are getting physically moved from one place, either voluntary or forced. We do not know. I don't go into the classifications. Some people volunteer to move, as we have the present Indian diaspora moving to Canada or Australia or US for that matter. That can be described as a voluntary movement. So there is a geographical aspect of moving from one place to another. And even while you are deeply, firmly rooted in your own homeland, one is likely to feel out of place. How does it happen? You have a sense that you are out of place, even in your own place, even in your homeland. This is a very strange experience, a sense of alienation that one feels. We feel this sense of a diasporic experience even while we are firmly rooted in our homeland. This could be attributed to what is happening to the world around us. I think you understand it. What is happening to the world around us? Today we feel it. Today I feel it. I don't know how many of you share it. The world around us has changed. And we feel the so-called, diasporic experience of being out of place. When you say something, when you look around, you find that the world itself has undergone so much of change. Earlier people used to describe this kind of, psychic experience of being a diaspora as a generation gap. When children grow, when they start, presenting desiderata or prescriptions to the parents complained, generation gap. The world around us has changed. We feel diasporic. That is also there. So there are two levels of experience of diaspora, but in our diaspora studies, the focus is essentially not on this kind of a traumatic experience that we feel even while we are firmly rooted in our homeland, but the studies concern themselves with the kind of trauma, the kind of torture, the kind of, rootlessness, what Homike Baba calls, the in-betweenness, the so-called third space. We are getting trapped in that liminal space, probably. This is the major concern of our discussion today. Okay, and I leave this kind of a rootlessness that we feel while being rooted in our homeland as not a subject fit for our studies called diaspora studies. Okay. Well, colonialism, how did it thrive? Colonialism, it started in the early 16th century with the Dutch, the French, and the English, and others. Okay. Even before that, we have, mini avatars of globalization. What Paranjabi calls it, mini avatars of globalization we had. I will come to that later. How did globalization thrive? Globalization thrived on the principle of othering, creating the other. The colonizer colonized binary. The colonizer is always held to be superior racially, at least racially, intellectually, in all matters, superior to the colonized. So the colonized were made the other. This process of othering and establishing a kind of moral superiority over the colonized has been the guiding principle on which colonialism thrived. It survived. Well, and if you look at this, we find as part of othering, there are certain binaries consciously created. Edward Said makes a list of them. I don't refer to him. Of course, I should acknowledge my indebtedness to him. See, for example, the black versus white, the colonizer versus the colonized, the center versus the periphery. The center versus the periphery. These are all, binaries created for the process of othering and making the colonized to feel inferior in all respects to the colonized. And if you look at the process, we find we are able to identify certain power centers or centers of power connected with this process of colonialism. The first power center, which was very successfully, effectively, assiduously employed by colonial powers, happens to be the census. The census. Taking a census and, identifying people, classifying them, making a demographic profile or composition of the country. So the first tool used in the process of othering and expansion of colonialism happens to be the census, which is a socio-metric device, okay, creating a social metrics. The second is the cartography, drawing of maps of different nations. Probably this has created what is called the wrong notion of the so-called nation state. Drawing of maps, fixing boundaries, okay, McMahon line and other lines. Well, and finally there is the museum where you can find very strange people, Africans or Negroes. You might have studied in British history during the Tudor dynasty. It was Edward I, I believe, that first ordered the Jews to be sent away from the London city, and they were forced to stay only in the far-flung suburban areas of London. And later, with the slave trade in progress, after Sir Francis Drake, completing that circumnavigation, returning home with enormous wealth, how did he mobilize this wealth? Through slave trade. And after all this, we can find that, there were instances of the blacks or the Negroes that's brought to England. Some of them, very few of them could enter the household of Queen Elizabeth even, as maid in waiting, or maybe as doing some menial jobs in the court. But there is an interesting incident noted by, Stephen Greenblatt in this Renaissance self-fashioning, that the Prince of Wales, some Prince of Wales, not the present one, yes, the occasion was the marriage of the Prince of Wales, and for the marriage celebration, some chariot was to be drawn, originally planned to be drawn by horses or elephants, because they were all, the signs of extravagance. But Prince of Wales, all on a sudden, insisted that instead of the horses or the elephants, the chariot should be driven by Negroes. And 2 Negroes drove the chariot in extreme cold conditions, and when the celebration was over, their bodies were found dead on the floor. This is beautifully given by Greenblatt. the kind of Renaissance England, the kind of slave trade, and how the blacks were used for entertainment and as a sign of, something to be looked at and enjoyed, to be looked atness. Okay, yes, exactly. Something to be looked at as curios, black figures. So, the third thing, the process of othering made use of in expanding or sustaining colonialism was, the first thing was the census, the second thing was the map, and the third thing was the museum. They have become the empirical evidences of social, geographical and cultural belonging in the post-colonial world. This has been stated by none other than Benedict Anderson, talking about the so-called imagined communities. These three have become emblematic of, the post-colonial world, empirical evidences, which were used very successfully by the colonial masters. Sorry to make a reference to theorists, Homi K. Bhabha also talks about the poetics of exile, the rather grim prose of political and economic refugees characterizing the post-colonial history. Look at those expressions only, beautiful expressions, therefore I just wanted to reproduce them. The poetics of exile and the rather grim prose of political and economic refugees, which are characteristic features of the post-colonial history or post-colonial world. Of course, it goes without saying that colonialism resulted in large-scale migration, either forced in the form of slavery or exile, or voluntary, on their own volition. Say, for example, soldiers moving from one place to another, and the indentured plantation laborers. We know about this. The indentured or on contract basis, laborers were employed on large scale by the Dutch, the French, and the English. In fact, the Indian indentured workers or plantation workers working mostly in the Caribbean and places like Fiji, Mauritius, Trinidad, and other places, who are supposedly the ancestral diaspora of the present Indian diaspora. So that could be thought of as something like voluntary migration, not forced migration. So soldiers moving from one camp to another, or indentured workers or contract laborers moving from one place to another, cannot be thought of as forced displacements, even though there is an element of force or coercion being used in the indentured workers' history. If you study history properly, look at the process of recruitment of laborers. Because it was from 1853 to 1917, because 1917 was the year when the practice was stopped. The indentured workers' practice was stopped in 1917. It was abolished. And so from 1853, Lord Dalhousie, 1853 to 1917, if you look at this period, we find the Indian indentured workers diaspora in existence mostly by the English people. Before that, right from 1615, in early part of the 17th century, we have the Dutch imposing indenture, and then the French imposing indenture. But the Indian indentured diaspora emerges only after the British started recruiting and employing large numbers of Indian laborers, plantation laborers, for the plantations in their colonies from 1853 to 1917. Well, so there could be two types of displacement. One is called voluntary, the other is called forced migration or forced, displacement. And now when we come to the third phase, The third phase is the post-colonial phase, the end of colonialism and the beginning of the newer phase called globalization in the 90s. I'm just trying to identify the three phases, then we will discuss the other areas connected with the three movements towards, or in the second half of my presentation. So we move from colonial diaspora to the period of, post-colonial diaspora, and then to globalization and post-globalized world. When we talk about the indentured workers, or when we talk about the colonial diaspora, we actually talk about the movement of a particular kind of capital. There's a very interesting statement made by Brazil. Brazil writes, during the colonial period, many items were sold, say for example, capital goods. You may understand what is meant by that. Capital goods, gems, jewelries, and slaves. And slaves. They are all equated with commodities on sale. This was the period called, the colonial period. But when we enter the colonial period, we find that the capital that was always on the move was named the merchant capital, which was a term employed by, the British rulers, the merchant capital. A merchant company was formed, and permission was issued to them for trade, and thus East India Company was established. Later, they started finding or identifying, sea route to India, sea route to Africa, Columbus going one side, Vasco da Gama moving to this side, another man reaching Goa in the same year, Amerigo Vespucci reaching that place and, calling that unidentified place America, probably resulting in a lot of confusion. The exploration, identification of sea routes to different parts of the world, all taking place during the Renaissance period, exactly created the movement of a particular kind of capital called the merchant capital, because the capital, standing for capitalism, was represented by one class named the merchant class. They were merchants, in fact. And the merchants, they wanted to generate profit, and so the merchant capital started being in circulation during the colonial period. But when we move to the post-colonial period, another kind of capital replaces the merchant capital. Any guess? Oh, question, sorry. Another new kind of capital has replaced the old merchant capital. What is it called? What is it called? It is called simply late capital. Late capital. What is this late capital? It is characterized by the uncertainties of the market and the uncertainties of the nation state. This kind of a new capital, which is characteristic of post-colonial period, is connected itself with uncertainties of market. You cannot predict market. And also it is connected with uncertainties of nation state. Probably you can lose your identity anytime when this capital starts moving. We, in simple language, refer to early modernism and late modernism to refer to these two periods when the merchant capital moved freely during the colonial period and the late capital used to move freely after the post-colonial period. We will have more of this discussion after identifying the phases. We will come to this post-colonial scenario or the globalized scenario of diaspora in my discussion. But as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the end of colonialism or the emergence of post-colonial world, and the opening up of the world, the so-called global village and globalization, we have to bear in mind that there were some traces of prototypical traces of globalization which existed even in the classical period. Say, for example, a new world order similar to the so-called globalized world was in existence even centuries before. The first one is the Holy Roman Empire, which started spreading all across the globe. Almost, 3/4 of the whole world was under the Holy Roman Empire, which was later replaced by the Ottoman Islamic State, the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic world. The first was Christendom. The second was Islamic world, the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire frequently attacked from the east by the Mongols and by the Crusaders who were passing through this place. The Crusaders did the greatest damage to the Ottoman Empire. Millions of people were killed. It is given to understand that millions of people of the Turkish Ottoman Empire got killed by the Crusaders. They could very simply resist the attack of the Mongols from the east. But it was more dangerous to resist the attack unleashed by the passing Crusaders, the Christians. But with the discovery of America and the so-called explorations, finding of new sea routes, by the end of the 15th century or the turn of the 16th century, a new world order has come into existence, which we refer to as the colonial world. The era of colonialism has begun. The era of colonialism has something very fascinating about it, because it cannot be thought of as a monolithic entity in itself. It was rather a combination or a mix of several things. Say, for example, it contained elements of imperialism. I'm afraid I'm talking high theory. No, I'm not. I have no intention. But by accident, if I do, please remind me. Please give a warning. Okay, right. I don't intend to talk high theory. If something is unintelligible, please tell me. I can stop, because I have plenty of time. And we have got some matter to discuss, that's all. Well, it was not a monolithic entity. When we talk about colonialism, it cannot be thought of as a monolithic entity. It contained elements of imperialism. Yes, that is understandable. Then, by the end of the 18th century, there was the Industrial Revolution taking place in England. As a result, we can say that imperialism got clubbed or got combined or got fused with industrialization. Thus, colonialism and early modernity encompassed imperialism, industrialization, and the so-called merchant capital besides. Everything came together during this colonial period. So look at the scenario. The first globalized world was represented in antiquity by the Holy Roman Empire, then replaced by the Ottoman Empire. Then with the emergence of colonialism, we have this colonial world coming into existence with combined elements of imperialism, Industrial Revolution and industrialization, followed by the merchant capital, particularly connected with the British merchant capital. If we look at the post-colonial world, and if we focus more upon the final phase of diaspora connected with globalization, we can discern or identify certain major migration patterns or displacement patterns or movement patterns. We have entered the final phase, post-colonial or the globalized phase, where we can identify certain patterns, regular patterns of movement. Say, for example, somebody has identified for me. I cannot identify myself. 5 patterns of movement. The first movement is from Asia to the US and Canada. The destination countries, or what we call the host countries, home country, host country, right? The host countries, or the favorite destinations were US and Canada. So people from Asia started moving to the US and Canada. Secondly, people from Central America moving to US and Canada. So Asians moving to US and Canada. People from Central America, Brazil, Argentina, and all that, people moving to US and Canada. Then people of African origin moving to Europe. Okay, we will talk about the transatlantic, the black Atlantic of Paul Gilroy later, when we talk about the slave trade of African Negroes. Well, how Atlantic route, the Middle Passage, what is known as the Middle Passage, connected with the Atlantic Ocean, has become the venue of the most serious, deadly of all trades in the world, the slave trade. Some 12 million African slaves were shipped off in chains during some 300 years for this slave trade. Well, now the third is African people moving to Europe. The fourth pattern in the post-colonial world is Asians again moving to Europe. Now look at Asians' omnipotence, or omnipresence, better say. Asians first moved to US and Canada, and now Asians moving to Europe. And the fifth pattern is very interesting. That is very typical of we Malus. Okay? The Indian people and the Southeast Asians moving to a favorite destination. 1970s. The Middle East. So in the globalized world or the post-colonial world, these 5 patterns of movements or migrations could be easily catalogued or can be identified. As a result of these migrations, who are the beneficiaries, who are the sufferers? That subject will be dealt by economists, not by students of English literature. But we will have to have a look at the kind of consequences these large-scale migrations produced on the settler nation, the destination. Say for example, US, Canada, Australia, Europe or Middle East. What consequences were produced upon the settler nation or the so-called host country? There was serious shift in the demographic profile of the settler nation. As we all know, Canada is a very sparsely populated country. It still encourages skilled migration. Remember, these are all terms to be reckoned with. Skilled migration, not all and sundry. Only skilled people can migrate. They are encouraged. And this is one of the reasons why Indian esteem has gone up in recent years. Only skilled people go abroad. വിവരമുള്ളവർ മാത്രമേ പുറത്തോട്ട് പോകുന്നുള്ളൂ. ഇച്ചിരി ബോധവും വെളിവും ഒക്കെ ഉള്ളവർ മാത്രമേ വെളിയിൽ പോകുന്നുള്ളൂ. അതുകൊണ്ട് നമുക്ക് വെളിയിൽ ഇപ്പോൾ ഇച്ചിരി പേരുണ്ട്, ഇവിടെ പേരില്ലെങ്കിലും. കാരണം ഇവിടെ എല്ലാവർക്കും എന്തും ചെയ്യാമല്ലോ. അവിടെ അങ്ങനല്ല. അങ്ങോട്ട് ചെല്ലണമെങ്കിൽ തന്നെ ഒരു മിനിമം ഡെസിഡിറാറ്റ ഉണ്ട്. അതുള്ളവർക്ക് മാത്രമേ കയറി പോകാൻ പറ്റത്തുള്ളൂ. This is the problem. This is an advantage. So it has created the large-scale migration of people from different parts, say from Asia, Central America, Africa, India and Southeast Asia, has resulted in what is called a shift in the demographic profile of the host nations, or better say the settler nations. Of all these countries, of all these destinations, today, as per the latest estimates available, America happens to be the largest settler nation by the first decade of the 21st century, the new millennia. America happens to be the largest settler nation in the first decade of the new millennia. Now look at the story of our people. Asians and Southeast Asians in particular. The entry to the US for Southeast Asians was under control, under check. It was allowed only in 1965. The entry of other communities were allowed earlier, but the entry of Southeast Asians or South Asians was permitted to the US only since 1965. And if you look at today's demographic profile of the US, it is amazing to find that about 70% of the immigrant population, 70% of the immigrant population from different parts of the world to the US have settled in 6 states of America, the US. Only in 6 states there is a clustering. Which are the 6 states? I can name: New York, California, Illinois, Texas, Florida, and New Jersey. Does it have any implication? These are the 6 states where, the migrants from different destinations to the US, about 70% of them are clustered in these 6 states. Does it have any implication? Does it mean anything else? Yes, it means. Because these are the 6 states which are technologically the most advanced and leading in the service sectors of the United States of America. Which gives us a clear indication that most of the migrants to these places, these 6 states, New York, New Jersey, Florida, Illinois, California, and one more, Texas. It reveals the fact that these states are technologically the most advanced of all the states in America where these diaspora could make an entry. It also shows or sheds useful light on the quality of the diaspora into these states. They are all technically qualified people reaching these 6 states of America. Look at the other instance, because I have taken only 2 examples. One is America, United States of America, to talk about the post-colonial period, and the other is Britain. After the Second World War, migration in large number of people from the colonial nations or the colonies, the erstwhile colonies, was made possible only after the Second World War. South Asians were permitted to enter Britain only in 1948. But when they were permitted, Caribbeans, Indian and African settlers, they had to face, in the early stages of their migration to the UK, they had to face bitter racial discrimination. But later, with the passage of, anti-racist acts in the UK, there was an easing of the situation. Racial discrimination slowly eased off. And the signing of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, yes, which paved the way for globalization, and the consequent globalization forced Britain to leave discriminatory practices. London, if you look at London today, it is one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the world, which is very much noted for being the most multicultural of all capital cities of the world, multi-ethnic. These 2 examples of US and Britain highlight that displacement has become an unavoidable phenomenon in contemporary society. There's something very interesting. Earlier it was something forced upon people. If you look at the classical cases, it was something that was forced upon people against their will. But today, in the post-colonial world, it is something that has become unavoidable. Crossing the border is no longer a traumatic experience. It has become something like an ecstatic experience. We cannot any longer talk about victim diasporas or labor diasporas or trade diasporas as Robin Cohen would do. Rather, we should today talk about, people crossing the borders with a great degree of ecstasy, because that marks out a new life for them. That marks out social mobility and something like empowerment. Well, therefore, today, to define a nation, yes, this is the problem, nation. Okay. Therefore, today to define a nation, one has to look at the many displaced populations living within a geographical area. If you talk about India, and if you want to define India as a nation, you don't have to look upon a homogeneous group of people called Indians here. But you will have to look at a variety, a baffling variety of displaced peoples living within a geographical space. Say, if you take the Indian case, ever since the Aryan invasion took place, later came the Greeks, the Macedonians under Alexander the Great, spread of Islam and ousting of Parsis from Persia, and the Parsis came in large number to India, okay, from Persia to India. Then the Arab traders came, then the Persians, Afghans, Turkish traders, Mughal invasion occurred, the arrival of the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the English finally, the Jews in large number, Nepalis, Bangladeshis, all came to India. Therefore, to define a nation today needs to define a variety of displaced people living within a geographical boundary called India. It is not simply defining Indians. It is no longer a matter of defining the people of a particular country as people belonging to that country, but a variety of displaced communities living together. But India had this, yes, noble tradition of assimilating and accommodating all these vast and varied traditions and cultures into our social ethos, and we could retain, at the same time, they could retain, the people who came to us, they could retain their distinct cultural insignia, and at the same time, India could assimilate them into the main fold. Well, now, since I have very limited time at my disposal, I would wind up this discussion with what is called, I actually plan to give something like the theorizing connected with making distinctions between exiles, refugees, expatriates, and nomads given by Edward Said, but I leave that because exile, a person can be defined as an exile when he has no chance of returning to his homeland. Whereas an expatriate has a chance to return to his homeland, if at all this myth of return and the so-called homeland are closely connected with the essential characteristics of a diaspora. Okay. Of course, there are other theorists like Ashcroft who defines diaspora not merely in terms of geographic dispersal, but in terms of identity, memory, and home. Identity, memory, and home. Generally now it is accepted that diaspora doesn't include all geographical dislocations or displacements, but only those instances of deterritorialized, dispossessed, and displaced communities. Remember the three expressions. Not all. See, for example, my journeying from Trivandrum yesterday to reach Ernakulam here for this session itself was a traumatic experience as far as I, as an individual is concerned, because all the way I was thinking about how my daughter will be brought to school tomorrow, who will be assigned the task of that, who will take care of this and that at home. So that cannot be taken as part of diaspora studies. Not all geographical dislocations can be thought of as coming under the ambit of diaspora studies. Only those instances of deterritorialized, dispossessed and displaced communities cut off from their homes, customs, protectorship and citizenry or citizen rights. Only these cases can be now discussed under the rubric of diaspora studies. I come to the Indian diaspora. That will be yes. The Asian diaspora, I will begin with Asian diaspora, and with this I will end my discussion. The Asian diaspora, contemporary Asian diaspora, and their unique status among the host nations in aiding the growth of a cosmopolitan world has been emphasized by theorists. See, for example, it is all because of certain particular categories being encouraged to migrate. The migration of highly qualified doctors, engineers, etc. And now I give you an example. When we talk about Sony, make believe, right? Sony, the brand, Samsung, Angli, Jetli, Mississippi, Masala, Mira Nair. Now all these exactly symbolize not Asia, symbolize the West. These are all contributions made by the Asian diaspora. And if you look at the Asian diaspora writers, we have V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, Hanif Qureshi, Kazuo Ishiguro, the Japanese writer, the Nobel winner. All these people have made attractive and contributions to the Asian identity being projected as something that is to be appreciated worldwide. The study of South Asian diaspora was much neglected until recently. People started studying about the classical diasporas. All were talking about Jewish diaspora, talking about African slave diaspora, indentured diaspora. But the South Asian diaspora has gained attention only in recent times, say by the turn of the new century, 21st century. This Asian diaspora is unique from the rest of the diasporas because they have no myth of the return to home, because they have already an established home. They were never uprooted from their homes. They already have a home, and they don't have any so-called myth of return to a homeland. They have diverse origins, Koreans, say for example, Chinese, Lebanese, Indians, diverse origins. And they never form a separate unity called South Asian diaspora. They retain their individual features. They never become a unit. Their distinctive differences are kept alive. Probably based on religion, region and language, these differences were kept alive. One of the reasons why the South Asian diaspora as a generic term has never been seriously discussed. But that was a certain advantage to the South Asian diaspora. Only with the emergence of a transnational public sphere since the 1990s. What do you mean by that? Yes, we all know, transnational public sphere. With the introduction of the so-called internet, Meera Nair's films, or probably, Manoj Shyamalan's films, fashion industry, internet, literature, music. Only with this, which are all together referred to as the transnational public sphere, that people all on a sudden came to know about a separate diaspora named South Asian diaspora through films, through music, through other contributions. I end my discussion with the Indian diaspora writers as of today. The Indian diaspora, Asian diaspora, Indian diaspora. The Indian diaspora is remarkable not only by its size, it is very huge in its size number, but by achievements as well. A new form of self-fashioning, self-fashioning was happening among the Indian diaspora. A report said that of all the ethnic groups living in the US today, the one ethnic group with the highest life expectancy was by the Indian diaspora. 89.3 years, the highest life expectancy. That is one great achievement. Only 4% of the UK population is constituted by a so-called Indian diaspora, but they contribute more than 10% of the total economic output of the UK. Okay. And if we look at the two periods, we have an old Indian diaspora and a new contemporary Indian diaspora. The old represented by scientists like S. Chandrasekharan and Hargobind Khurana in science. Naipaul and Rushdie in literature, Lakshmi Mittal in UK with big business, steel business, Meera Nair and Manoj Naityamal and Subin Mehta in music, the others in film industry. These are all some celebrities connected with the Indian diaspora as it exists today. The old generation diasporic writers like Raja Rao, Nirat C. Chowdhury, Ved Mehta, Kamala Markandeya, all these people, they looked back at India. This is a very amazing thing. They all, after reaching these foreign lands or host lands, they looked back at India, nostalgically recollecting India, as if they came to know about India only when they were out of India. As an outsider only they could look upon India. But look at the new Indian diaspora writers. There is a sharp difference in their attitudes. The older generation writers, whose names I have mentioned, they never recounted their experiences as expatriates. Well, they remained outsiders and looked longingly, nostalgically, from an outsider's perspective to India. But the new diaspora is different from the old diaspora. They too write about the nation imaginary. But the tone is only elegiac, not nostalgic. The tone is only elegiac, not nostalgic. Anita Desai, Bharati Mukherjee, Amitav Ghosh, Shashi Tharoor, Vikram Seth, Jhumpa Lahiri, all made their names. All could, carve a niche for themselves only during the stay abroad, not while in India. They all could carve a name for themselves only when they were abroad, not in India. And I end with this final, classification of the two groups of new diaspora writers. One, the first group is constituted by some writers who spent some years in India, then took their baggage and left India for some foreign destination. They spent some years in India, so they carry with the memories of India. And the second category of contemporary diasporic Indian writers are people of Indian origin, born and brought up outside of India. They don't have any Indian experiences. The second category writers, they do not have any Indian experiences. There are some writers of both the categories. I mean, the contemporary as well as the old diasporic Indian writers who wrote exclusively on Indian subjects, while some wrote exclusively on subjects or themes concerning the life of the foreigners in the host land or in the host nation. See, for example, The Golden Gate by Vikram Seth is about the life of not Indians in America, but Americans in America. Even though certain Indian characters emerge. So some started writing most Indian diasporic writers, contemporary diasporic writers, they focus or they choose characters or, subject or themes from Indian life, while some specialize even on writing on European characters and themes and, even other host nations. Well, this is this is not what I intended. I just intended of doing something more in between, but I leave that aside. Please, I will wind up with one statement from Makarand Paranjpe. With the statement, I think you may get an idea about how things have transformed or evolved through various phases of development of diaspora, right from the classical diaspora of the Jews, Armenians and Africans, slave trade, then from colonialism, then post-colonial and the globalized. These are the four areas I have touched upon. I shall end my presentation with this statement from Makarand Paranjpe. M.K. Gandhi, that is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, became a Mahatma not in India. Not in India, but among the indentured plantation laborers in South Africa. Because he fought for their rights as a barrister, as an advocate. He became first an activist among the indentured workers, the plantation workers in South Africa. So I think I have given you some ideas about the kind of, evolution of the concept of diaspora, the phases through which it has passed. And if that is fruitful, I thank God and I thank all the people who have assembled here. And I extend my heartfelt, sincere thanks to the Department of English of Maharaja's College, Autonomous College, right? For inviting me to give a short lecture on this subject. And I thank all the HOD and all the members. Besides, in absentia, I express my gratitude to the principal and the college authorities. And I thank all of you for, listening to me at, for more than 90 minutes. More than 90 minutes. I do not know, maybe floods, the recent floods have taught us to be a little more patient. And I appreciate your patience. And I thank you for listening to me. Thanks a lot.